So therefore, that's why Nichiren Shonin, and also as Komoto Sensei said, it was the main teaching of in Japan at that time. Also, Jodo Shinshu, Jodo Shu, or Jodo Buddhism, practice is different, right? So basically, you think about next world. So when I was a monk in the Chinese Buddhism, also in Chinese Buddhism, all the other teachings are there. Zen Buddhism, Mikyo, all of those things are there. But the one that most people practice is Nembutsu, right? Because what it also means is get to the Pure Land and get the merit, right? So therefore, all of the practices that most priests go through at the beginning, it all has to do with Nembutsu. And basically, it's kind of like I called it the way that they, have influenced it. I called it the Olympic Nembutsu system, because you can be born in the bronze lotus, or the silver lotus, the gold lotus, or platinum lotus. Kind of like membership levels, depending on how many chanting you do, and usually how much you give, right? So I mean, because it was quite uncommon for people would come from prosperity preaching, right? God pays out dividends. It's interesting, because when I was a monk, people would approach me all the time and go, Sifu, what is my rebirth in the Pure Land look like? How long do I have to stay there? Because the idea of Pure Land was that this world you couldn't study, right? So you had to go to Pure Land where it was peaceful and calm, because life was too unstable here, and we're too slow. So therefore, we're right in front of the Buddha. He teaches us, and then after some lives, which go by very fast, you can become enlightened through the power. Yes?
I just want to ask, this Pure Land thing, I just find it a bit difficult to...
Yeah.
But that has developed purely from the Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings, but what teachings did that...
Exactly. Well...
That's what I'm wondering, because I can't see where that
Well,
came from.
actually, and the way that Pure Land is presented now, it is something that is built on and built on and built on.
Right.
So actually, the teaching, and Nichiren Shonin is actually one of the only people that allowed, like when I was reading it, that actually made some very valid points about this practice, and saying, the practice of the Pure Land, and even how it's interpreted in Japan, because you have to look at Japanese Buddhism, very different than Indian Buddhism or Chinese. So they very much trade everything together, right? They separate. In Chinese Buddhism, usually all together, and then each person has own practice, right? So Pure Land Buddhism is just a additional. So actually, how about Zen Buddhism? What do they have to do with Pure Land Buddhism? Zen Buddhism is what? Attain some awakening, right?
Yeah.
Right, at this life. But how many people in Zen that attained awakening?
Not much.
Not much. So at end of life, they pray to go to Pure Land. So all Zen funeral and Zen when dying, they use the Pure Land Buddhism. So the idea is that in traditional Buddhism, practice, 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 but then in the next life, Amida Buddha's great vow will say, I'll take care of you now. Kind of like you tried your best, and now you come back to live at your parents' house. You went to college, you got a job, and now you're coming back to your parents' house because you didn't quite make it yet, So that's what that reminds me of.
So the Buddha that's used in the Pure Land is not the Shakyamuni Buddha, but where has that deity come from?
Well, it comes from the text that the Buddha specifically say about the Amida Buddha, who is his vow. So as you know, there are many emanations, right?
Yeah.
So even Lotus Sutra and other places, Amitayas Buddha, Amitabha Buddha, is actually there, is seen as just another world. Because medicine Buddha is interesting, right? Pure Land Buddha is in what direction? West. How about east? It is a medicine Buddha. Then all these different heavens, Miroku is in Shita heaven, and all these different level of heavens of all, basically because what is the Bodhisattva vow? To save sentient beings, right? So within their capacity from other worlds even, they're trying to think how to save sentient beings. So that's essentially where the teaching came from. But of course, in the secularized manner, they said specifically, all right, this is the only way but it confused people. So that's why also Nichiren Shonin says that that the founders of these sects were slandering Buddhism. And what is the slander of Buddhism? Is teaching it inappropriately. So slander doesn't mean that they were, basically saying bad things about Buddhism, but sometimes they were, because in this tradition also, the severity of this was what? That they said, you don't need any of the other Buddhist texts. Just get rid of them. Even burn them, for all I care. All you need to do is chant the Amida Buddha's name, and you can get salvation. So, but Nichiren Shonin said, well, Amida Buddha is another world, but Shakyamuni Buddha is this world. And then in the Lotus Sutra, what do they ultimately teach? The eternal Buddha, right? And that the eternal Buddha pervades this world, and that the Pure Land is actually here, not somewhere else. So that's the idea of the Pure Land. If that teaching, because think about it, if you taught people that, what would be the understanding in a harsh time? Because that's why I believe Lotus Sutra is proper for this time, right? Because if you just simply become empathetic towards the world, and that's why when people look at most religions that deal with the afterlife or the thereafter, it's kind of scary, right? Because it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that they want this world to end because they got no investment in this world. This world is considered dirty and disgusting. So do you think people who believe in that are necessarily going to vote, or take care of things? That's scary, because one of the Bill Maher, when he went to the White House in his movie Religious List, he said, he's sitting there he goes, I'm just really concerned that somebody who's dictating my government believes in talking snakes and the end of the world and all this kind of stuff, and then makes law. And then the guy goes, well, you don't have to be a genius to become a politician. So he basically made fun of himself without knowing it. So the idea is that directly what the beliefs are makes a positive teaching or a negative, right? This teaching as by itself is not a negative teaching, but how it was interpreted by these leaders made it a very dangerous teaching, according to Nichiren Shonin, especially in those times of desperation, right? Because if you look at the Lotus Sutra, positive, right? And saying you can attain enlightenment in this life, right? You can attain enlightenment through your own means. You can attain enlightenment and you can connect with the eternal nature, and that this world here now is the Pure Land, which then you have to look at the world differently, right? Because if you think this world is, as it says in the sutra, the people think that this world is in a great ball of fire, that the end of Kalpa of destruction is coming, like we can't wait for it. He goes, in reality, this world of mine is peaceful. It is filled with gods and men, right? Same idea. So gods and men, this connection, Nichiren Shonin thinks, this is how we influence this world. And actually, the reason why I think Rissho Ankoku, and this is why I'll continue tomorrow, there's a very practical way to use it. And actually, some schools of Buddhism have actually done it in saying there is an important concept in establishing the true teaching. What does that mean, making everyone Buddhist? No. What it means is that we present through our lives as followers and practitioners of the Lotus Sutra and disciples of Nichiren Shonin, we put forward this teaching as an answer. Because one thing I learned in this world, right, and you learn it more than when you're younger, right? Because when you're young, you think, oh, if I just do this, I can change everyone, right? Or if I just become a dictator or strong, I can stop all crime, or all of these things on how to change the world. The war on drugs, right? We see that's just by locking people up and doing stuff like that, not changing people, but converting them more into criminal, violent offenders, right? Myoke Shonin goes to the prison, so I got to meet these people. But when we instill Buddhism into people, especially the Buddhism of the Lotus Sutra, the great vehicle, the vehicle that includes all teaching, all people are able to, in any current situation, whether they're in hell or in the human or any of the in-between realms, they can be able to, in their current state, find relief from, how do you say, I don't want to use the word suffering, but unsatisfactory existence, right? So, then finally, Nichiren singles out Honen because he believes that the passages in Nembutsu are what is causing the main issue at that time because it was the primary teaching. And then the sixth section is his appeal to the shogun to rid the teachings of the Nembutsu from the country. And then the seventh section is outlawing the slanderers as a mean of preventing natural disasters. The eighth section is suggests stop giving alms to the slanderers as a way of preventing calamities. So again, in Buddhism, right, alms, right, which is basically any kind of support, what does that relate to? Eightfold path. Correct giving, right? Correct action. So therefore, in how you're giving alms to people is a natural response. So in Buddhism, just to give somebody something is not without personal responsibility. Because through awakening, you should know how that could be used. For good or for bad, right? $1 million could be used for something very good or for something very bad. But depending on the enlightenment of the person who gives it, the awareness, we know that if that's a quick fix or a long-term fix, right? In the idea that, they use the idea in the Bible that, you give a man a fish he eats for a day, you teach a man to fish he eats forever, right? So that kind of idea that we have to be mindful of how even we give alms to people. So that's why some schools of Nichiren Buddhism became very severe about this alms. That mustn't give to anyone who doesn't study Nichiren Buddhism. And the eighth section, let's see here. Nichiren warns that domestic disturbances and invasion from foreign troops. So all of this saying, doctrinally, saying we should remove this teaching, why it's difficult. Nichiren Shonin, because the government, do they particularly care about religious issues? Deep down inside? Probably not. So he does something that's very interesting. He has predictions as well. Basically, result, effect, cause effect of the continued behavior of the government. And what were those two? Foreign invasions, which obviously in Japan was a big issue. Foreign invasion and
internal strife.
Internal strife. So like they say like civil war, but I think internal strife is a little more wider idea because civil war is very specific. I mean, look at the United States and most of the countries, lots of internal strife going on, right? So it's very polarized, more than it's been polarized in a long time. But foreign invasion too, right? These are still very relevant issues to people in the United States and throughout the world. And then he predicts this and says that if we establish the correct teaching, if you do not heed my idea, this is what will be resulting. And what happened? Both of these predictions came true. So that is why the government then started paying attention to Nichiren Shonin, right? Because first they blew him off, and what happened? Persecutions, right? His after submitting it, his hut was burned down, and basically he was run out of town. And then again he comes back and does it again, but then suddenly the Mongols invade. They got letters from the Mongols, and I'm sure the Japanese didn't help it by cutting off their heads and killing all the emissaries of the government and sending them back in pieces. But I'm sure that didn't help the foreign invasion issue. But when it happened, then the politicians started looking towards the Nichiren Shonin, and actually that's when they released him, is that start to ask him questions and to help. And also during that time, because of these predictions, what happened? Suddenly government wants you to be on their team, right? Most of the other founders of the other sects, you know what they did? You think they took the money? They took the money. They took the power, because originally they needed you then to pray for the state. They needed you to pray for the nation. But the Nichiren Shonin did not do that. That's why he go off into the final parts of his life to Minobu, right? But most of the other, and established his tradition there, most of the other people stayed and became very political. So priests back then were the people that, information wasn't disseminated the same way as it was now. It was disseminated by priests, because priests were basically the people who traveled to China, to Korea. So they had information. And temples were not necessarily just places of worship. They were also kind of political offices. They recorded births, deaths, everything. Also, most foreign, does anyone know Senno Rikyu, famous tea master? He got in trouble because he got involved in politics in between the feudal lords, because the tea ceremony, as beautiful as it is, was a very great, device for discussing political information. And unfortunately, when you get involved with that, sometimes you're on the right side, sometimes you're on the wrong side. And back then, if you're on the wrong side, you have to usually kill yourself. So that's what happened to Senno Rikyu. So at this time, and then finally, the last part, the main theme of this writing is that the Buddha land can be established on earth in this world through practicing the true Dharma. The idea of spreading peace throughout the country by establishing the true Dharma constitutes the core of Nichiren Buddhism, which Nichiren upheld through his lifetime. So Nichiren recopied the treatise several times during his life. The Rissho Ankoku, written sometime between the Kensho Koan era, which is about 1275 to 1288, and supplemented with important passages to refute Shingon Buddhism and harshly criticize Kukai, Enin, and Echin, which were disciples of the successors of Tendai. So therefore, that's the expanded edition later. But if you have a chance, tomorrow we'll go more into depth. That's the historical background. But if you can purchase this one, interesting enough, it has from the beginning to the end, and it's available there in the bookshelf, and also the pre-letters that he used to compile into the Rissho Ankoku. So tomorrow what I plan on doing is to show how this Rissho Ankoku document with some passages can be used in our practice, right? What does this have to do? Is this just a letter to the government from a rambling monk that decides that he has the answer? Actually, no, it's something that can truly establish world peace in its way to understanding how to spiritually influence. Because I realized with people in this world, as a regular citizen, right, as a common person, even if my parents wanted me to be a politician, so that's why I worked in Washington. But I realized politicians didn't have the answer. And then my family was also military, right? I realized through military action, they couldn't change things for the good either. So that's why I decided, as a priest, that through spiritual practice, through changing myself, the basic concept of Buddhism, through improving myself, I can then be able to successfully help others across the river to enlightenment, right? So therefore, this is Nichiren Shonin. So by explaining this to you, I hope you will then go read it. And when you read it, when we talk tomorrow, it'll give you some very deep understanding of how we can change this world. It's really profound. When I first read it, I was like, how does this work? But then you realize that it's actually an extremely important letter and teaching to us.